There's a story that's circulated for decades about caves beneath Death Valley. Caves said to be tied to something the Timbisha Shoshone and southern Paiute peoples supposedly knew long before any American prospector ever set foot in that basin. Some versions online claim ancient tunnels. Some claim lost civilizations. Some claim government cover-ups stretching back generations. But before we go any further, here's the honest starting point this video is built on. Most of what circulates about this topic isn't real oral tradition at all. It's internet legend, dressed up to look like indigenous knowledge. So what do we actually know? And what does it mean that a real place and a real people's real history got quietly buried under a story that was never truly theirs? This is a story about separating fact from fabrication, and about a landscape that deserves to be understood honestly, on its own terms. Let's start with what's real, because Death Valley's actual human history is genuinely remarkable, without needing any invented embellishment all. Death Valley, sitting in eastern California along the Nevada border, is one of the most extreme environments in North America. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and the valley floor at Badwater Basin sits 282 feet below sea level, the lowest point in the entire Western Hemisphere. It is, by almost any measure, one of the harshest places human beings have ever chosen to call home. And yet, people have lived there. The Timbisha Shoshone people have inhabited Death Valley for, according to archaeological and tribal evidence, at least 1,000 years, and likely considerably longer. Their name for the valley translates to the valley, and their traditional homeland encompasses not just the valley floor but the surrounding mountains. Seasonal migration allowed communities to escape the most brutal summer heat by moving to higher, cooler elevations. This is not a story about a people passing briefly through inhospitable land. This is a story about genuine mastery of one of the most demanding environments on the continent, built through generations of accumulated ecological knowledge, where reliable water sources could be found, which were edible and medicinal, how to time seasonal movement precisely enough to survive extremes that would kill an unprepared traveler within days. The southern Paiute, whose traditional territories extend across parts of present-day Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and California, share cultural and linguistic connections with Timbisha Shoshone as part of the broader Numixpe peoples of the Great Basin. Though it's important to note these are distinct nations with their own specific histories, communities, and territories, not a single interchangeable group. It's essential to say this plainly and respectfully. These are living nations. The Timbisha Shoshone tribe is federally recognized today, with a reservation located within Death Valley National Park itself, established through a 2000 federal land transfer that returned of their ancestral homeland after decades of advocacy. This is present-tense history, not a closed chapter belonging only to the past. So where does the idea of secret knowledge about caves actually come from? This is where responsible investigation requires real caution, because much of what circulates online tracing to supposed Paiute testimony about underground chambers, tunnels, or hidden civilizations beneath Death Valley from a specific well-documented source. A series of newspaper articles and later embellished retellings dating back to the early 20th century, describing claims of an underground network supposedly containing evidence of an ancient, non-indigenous lost race. These stories were never substantiated. No archaeological institution, no credible excavation, and no verified physical evidence has ever supported them. And critically, versions of these stories that get it to Paiute oral tradition were, according to researchers who've traced their origin, largely constructed or embellished by non-native writers and treasure hunters, often borrowing surface-level references to indigenous storytelling to lend the tales an air of ancient authenticity they didn't actually possess. This pattern should sound familiar because it echoes something we see across a lot of frontier-era folklore. Real indigenous nations, real complex spiritual and historical traditions, having fragments of their culture borrowed, distorted, and repackaged by outsiders into sensational stories that serve entertainment or profit rather than truth. That doesn't mean Death Valley has no genuine caves, or that indigenous knowledge about this landscape doesn't matter. It absolutely does. It just means the specific lost civilization version of this story deserves serious skepticism, not uncritical repetition. So let's actually look at what's documented carefully and see where the real evidence leads. Death Valley genuinely does contain numerous caves and rock shelters, a fact confirmed by both geological survey and archaeological research conducted over the past century. The region's geology, shaped by ancient volcanic activity, tectonic faulting, and millions of years of erosion, has produced a landscape riddled with natural cavities, some accessible, many genuinely dangerous and largely unexplored even today. Archaeological work conducted within Death Valley, including surveys carried out in cooperation with the National Park Service and university research teams over multiple decades, has confirmed genuine, documented evidence of indigenous use of rock shelters and cave sites throughout the region, dating back well over 1,000 years. These findings include stone tools, pottery fragments, and in several confirmed locations, rock art, evidence entirely consistent with the kind of seasonal, semi-nomadic land use patterns well documented among Great Basin peoples generally. One of the more specific, genuinely confirmed archaeological threads involves what researchers call the Death Valley and Valley Tathuri cultural periods, terms used by archaeologists to describe distinct phases of human occupation identified through careful excavation and dating of artifacts found at multiple sites throughout the valley and surrounding mountains, stretching back several thousand years before the more Timbisha Shoshone period that continues into the present day. This is where the story gets genuinely interesting without needing any invented drama at all. Death Valley's human history stretches much further than most popular retellings acknowledge, with archaeological evidence suggesting human presence in the broader region for potentially over 10,000 years, tied to a very different climate era when the valley itself held actual lakes and considerably more accessible water than the extreme desert conditions we associate with it today. So when we ask what the Paiute, most Timbisha Shoshone, whose actually is, genuinely knew at caves in this landscape, the honest, well-documented answer is this: they knew through countless generations of accumulated ecological knowledge which caves and rock shelters provide genuine shelter from extreme heat, which locations offered proximity to reliable seasonal water sources, and which sites held cultural or spiritual significance passed down through oral tradition specific to their own communities. That knowledge, real and substantial as it is, belongs to living tribal communities today, and the specific content of culturally sensitive traditions is not something appropriately detailed or speculated upon by outside researchers or documentarians, this video included. If you're the kind of viewer who appreciates history told honestly, even when that means gently correcting a popular but poorly sourced legend, this channel exists exactly for that kind of investigation. Subscribe now, because separating fact from fabrication here actually leads us somewhere more interesting than the original myth ever did. So let's talk directly about where the lost civilization beneath Death Valley story actually came from. and why it's important to be skeptical of it. The most commonly cited origin traces, reports, and popular retellings from the early 20th century describing claims by a small number of individuals, generally non-native prospectors or treasure hunters, who asserted they had discovered evidence of an ancient underground network beneath the valley containing artifacts and remains supposedly belonging to a technologically advanced, non-indigenous civilization. These claims were never independently verified by any credible archaeological institution. No physical evidence has ever been produced or examined by professional researchers. No excavation location has ever been consistently identified or confirmed. This pattern, sensational claims lacking any verifiable physical evidence, attributed loosely to vague Indian legends, without specific tribal sourcing, is a recurring feature of a lot early 20th century American pseudo-archaeology. It reflects, frankly, a broader historical pattern in which non-native writers and treasure hunters borrowed the language and authority of indigenous oral tradition to lend credibility to claims that had nothing to do with actual indigenous knowledge or belief. That's worth sitting with directly because it matters. When outside storytellers invoke ancient Native American legends without any specific tribal attribution, without any documented source, and without any actual collaboration with the communities they claim to be citing, that's not oral history. That's appropriation dressed up to sound authoritative. The National Park Service, which manages Death Valley National Park in ongoing consultation with the Timbisha Shoshone tribe, has not validated any claims of hidden underground civilizations within the park. Official park archaeological documentation focuses on the well-established, professionally verified history of indigenous habitation described earlier in this video, not on unsubstantiated treasure hunting legends that continue to circulate primarily online. There's also a more grounded, and frankly more respectful, why so many of Death Valley's caves, gone unexplored and undocumented by outside researchers. Much of this terrain remains genuinely dangerous, remote, and difficult to access safely, even with modern equipment, and significant portions of the park's cave systems have simply never been prioritized for the kind of exhaustive archaeological survey conducted at more accessible sites elsewhere. That's an honest, unglamorous explanation, and it happens to be the most likely one. There's a connection worth drawing here carefully between two genuinely separate threads of evidence, without overstating what either one proves. On one side, we have confirmed, professionally documented archaeological evidence of indigenous cave and rock shelter use throughout Death Valley, spanning thousands of years and multiple distinct cultural periods. On the other side, we have a widely circulated but entirely unsubstantiated lost civilization legend, traceable to early 20th century treasure hunting claims with no genuine connection to documented Timbisha Shoshone or Paiute tradition. These two threads are not the same story, and it would be inaccurate and honestly disrespectful to blend them together as though the real archaeological history somehow validates the invented legend. But together, they tell us something true and worth understanding. Death Valley really does hold genuine thousands of years old human history, one considerably more remarkable than any fabricated tale of underground civilizations ever managed to be. The real story simply required patient, respectful documentation instead of sensational invention. So where does this investigation actually leave us? The most responsible conclusion available, based on everything genuinely documented, is this. The popular lost civilization beneath Death Valley, often loosely attributed to Paiute tradition, is best understood as unsubstantiated early 20th century treasure hunting folklore, not authentic indigenous oral history. No credible archaeological evidence supports its central claims, and its attribution to native tradition appears, based on available historical research, to be largely a later embellishment rather than a genuine reflection of Timbisha Shoshone or Paiute belief. What is genuinely, powerfully true is this. The Timbisha Shoshone people have lived in and stewarded Death Valley for well over 1,000 years, developing an extraordinary depth and cultural about one of the harshest landscapes in North America, knowledge that includes real, confirmed use of regions, caves, and rock shelters, understood within cultural and spiritual contexts that belong to their community, not to outside storytellers looking for a dramatic hook. Maybe the more important question this investigates isn't what's hidden in those caves. Maybe it's this: how many other pieces of American folklore, presented for decades as ancient indigenous wisdom, are actually something else entirely, borrowed language wrapped around invented claims, obscuring the real, genuinely fascinating history that was there all along. Death Valley doesn't need an invented lost civilization to be remarkable. Its real story, thousands of years of human ingenuity and survival in one of the most extreme environments on Earth, was always the more compelling one. What do you think it says about how we tell history when a fabricated legend can circulate for a century while the real story sits quietly, waiting to be told accurately? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if you appreciate history told honestly, even that means challenging a popular myth, go ahead and subscribe for more researched deep dives into the past.